Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third lecture for this week, which is on feminism and queer theory. So, I want to just start off from the beginning that I know that many of you in this class are women's studies majors or have had some familiarity with the history of feminism and so forth. So, that being said, I'm already going to tell you that in this lecture, I'm not going to go too deep into the really rich and varied history of feminism, both here in the context of the United States, but of course, there's so much to talk about in other parts of the world around feminism. But I will cover a little bit of the history, and very importantly, I want to cover some key points of feminism that we will be exploring in this class. They're not the only points in feminism, and the readings for this week sort of gave you a little bit of introduction to different sort of fields of feminism, like, for example, Marxist feminism and so forth. But I'm just sort of covering key points that are going to be very important as we go forward in the weeks, because we're going to be definitely drawing upon them and working with them. And out of that, I'm also going to talk about how queer theory emerged out of feminism, out of women's studies, and with that, introduce to you sort of queer theory's intervention and activism in the field of women's studies, feminism, and feminist politics. So this slide might be redundant, but I do think it's necessary. Probably for this crowd, it's very redundant, but as somebody who teaches a lot of people, particularly in introduction to women's studies, I always sort of want to add this part that, we wouldn't be where we are. We definitely would not be having a class like this today if it wasn't for feminism. So obviously we can talk about how without feminism, legal, social, economic, rights, recognition, and so forth would not be here for women. Obviously, and we're going to talk about this a lot more in this lecture, is that, without feminism, particularly without feminist thinkers and theorists and scholars, as well as activists, our discussions around gender and how gender is a key governing factor in our society and affects our lives in pretty much at every instance, and that it's an important underlying mechanism around social control, as well as power, as well as access to resources and so forth. So without feminism, we really wouldn't be talking about the importance of gender. And as I'm going to talk about in this lecture, also about that without feminism, particularly feminist scholars, we would not be having these really important discussions around critiquing essentialism, especially in regards to biology and nature around gender. Of course, another key factor, kind of building on the importance of gender, is around that without feminism, we wouldn't have mobilization, political action against gendered power structures, because all power structures are gendered to certain degrees and much more. As well as, and something that we'll talk about in this class, and as we're going to be going forward, we will be using intersectionality a lot. Without feminist scholars and so forth, we would not have intersectionality, which has been one of the key important contributions and developments in the past 20 years. And of course, the purpose of this presentation, without feminism, without women's studies, we would not have queer theory. So I like to think about feminism as a continued conversation. And I think the reason why I do that is that I think that people will dismiss feminism, as well as we can talk about other sort of interventions around oppression regarding, for example, like civil rights or anything like that, that because it, hasn't isn't neatly confined, that there is arguments within the movement, that, it's ongoing, that somehow it's not good or not working. But in fact, the reason that I think the thing that makes feminism last and has last for, over 100 years or more has been that it is a dialogue. And it is very much open to change because it has to be. Because if its sole purpose is around equality and justice, then it will change. So whenever people ask me, well, what is the feminist movement? I would say it's a continued conversation that's been going on for over 500 years around gender justice and equality. So that being said, I sort of like to describe feminism as equality and justice for everyone across the gender spectrum. I know that's a very simplistic definition, and many feminist scholars have given their own sort of take on this. But the reason why I like to use this definition is that it's one, it's very simple, and it shares pretty much the core to many other feminist sort of descriptions of feminism. Also, I think it's pretty straightforward. That being said, feminism is not perfect. It is very much a work in progress. It is not unified, meaning that there are many divisions within not only the feminist movement, but within feminist scholarship, and that is good. It is also very important, not universal. So in this class, I think one is it's just the nature of teaching a class that introduces queer theory, as well as, being a summer class, which I know I've already talked to in the previous lectures about, like, oh, this is, where it's a bit of a balance doing a class like this. I do think it's really important to state that this class is very US centric, both within its discussion around feminism, but also in its discussion around queer studies, queer theory. And it's really important to recognize and to note that, that there have been many feminist movements, queer theorists that may or may not identify or use these terms, which are very much Western terms, to describe their their scholarship, their activism, and so forth outside of the United States, outside of the West, and have made significant and very important contributions to not only their communities, but especially to ours and our scholarship and activism and so forth. So it's also really important to say that feminism is not universal, nor does it have one history, even though I'm going to be sharing with you a very simplified history in regards to feminism in the West. Just know that it's not the only history, and even not the only history for feminism in the West. And then, very importantly, feminism is not complete. That's what I think is actually a strength. That, if we achieved everything, then, I mean, not to say that I don't want a socially just world, but at the same time, I don't think it's a deficit that it's not complete, because I think that's about us growing and changing and moving forward. And all of these sort of what I guess we would think of as, knocks against feminism, I think are actually positives towards feminism. That it's not perfect, that it is not unified, that it's not universal, and that it's not complete. Because it allows for the multitude of voices, and you will need the multitude of voices if you ever want to change the world for the better. So, for many of you in this class, You've already heard the lectures on these waves. And in fact, later in the semester, we're actually going to be talking about, are we still in the third wave, or maybe we're in a fourth wave around queer feminism? But typically, the history of feminism in the West, primarily in, United States, Canada, and parts of Western Europe, it has been that history. The mainstream feminist movement has been divided into three parts. You had the first wave around the 19th, earliest 20th century, and the main goal for that was political equality in regards to the right to vote, primarily the right to vote. The second wave happened starting from like the 50s, some say the 60s through the 80s, and the main goal was around social and cultural equality. That's in this wave you got advancements around laws that work to stop the discrimination against women in the workforce. Title IX, which is a education legislation that stopped the barring of women from entering educational programs and so forth. And of course, other sort of social legal changes such as Roe versus Wade, which allowed for access to abortion for women. Now, from the 1990s till now, and I put a question mark there, we are considered to be in the third wave, though, as we're going to talk about later in the semester, maybe we're in a fourth wave. But typically, the third wave is about continuing the struggle for social equality, legal equality, economic equality, but very importantly, with an emphasis on diversity and intersectionality. What is shared between all three waves, and however you want to divide up the history of feminism here in the United States, is an interrogation and as well as a critical challenge around power, particularly how power is structured around gender. And in order to talk about that, you need to talk about patriarchy. So, patriarchy is an unjust social system that enforces gender roles and is oppressive to both men and women. It has been patriarchy that has not only excluded women from positions of authority, governance, participation in politics, but also men, especially men of color, low income, immigrant, Native American, and so forth. It often includes any social mechanism that evokes male dominance over women. Male dominance, especially also over other men. It is a system of gender-based hierarchy in society which assigns most power to men, but again, it's usually just a certain select group of men. But in addition, it also assigns higher value to not only male-bodied, but maleness, masculine traits, and so forth. And with that, then you have the devaluing of feminine. And that both hurts men and women, as men who maybe are seen as having more feminine traits, like being emotional or sensitive or so forth, are devalued, are shamed, and etc. And of course, women themselves are being devalued because femininity is devalued. So, getting onto the significant contributions of feminism, one has been the importance of gender. So, as I mentioned previously in other lectures, gender distinctions are present in all cultures and all times. There's a great variety in gender, particularly outside of the West, which we rely on a two-gender system for the most part. There are many other communities outside of the West, as well as Native American communities that have more than one gender. But also, when we think about it, history, the way that there were other forms of genders even in Western history, as well as a wide variation of what people considered, proper roles, duties, responsibilities, presentation of men and women. So, what was feminine and what was masculine, and how should you behave to each assigned role, varied very much throughout history. And the thing is that, we start thinking more intensely about gender at times when gender configurations are undergoing major changes or shifts. So one example is the Industrial Revolution, spurring, more women to work outside of the home, just changing the dynamics of the society in general, where you have more people leaving the fields and the farms and going to factories to work, the rise of cities, just a whole dramatic upheaval of the way that people lived. And therefore, then, there was a lot of discussions around what are the roles for women. So one example of this is during the Victorian era, the 19th century, there was so many newspapers and public lectures around the woman question. And it's a phrase that's usually connected to this sort of panic during the Victorian era, where the fundamental roles of women were changing because women were entering the workforce and so forth, and it came out of a need also for women to have economic, social, legal independence. The suffragette movement was moving forward, and out of this sort of discussions, these panics of like the woman question, like what are women like now, and will they become shockingly just like men? In the sort of social upheaval, because society was changing, because of the Industrial Revolution and so forth, you had people then discussing, some fundamental concepts around how their society and their lives are structured, particularly around gender. So out of these conversations, during the Victorian era, you had people questioning about, is gender something that is biological, or is it a product of socialization? Like, are women naturally this way, or is it that society's making them more this way? To also then just this family structure. Is it sort of how they thought about families before, and specifically the duties assigned to a husband and a wife, a mother and a father, the sort of the power hierarchy within a family and so forth. Is that something that, naturally occurring, or is it something that is socially constructed and could be variable? These questions were emerging out of a time when there was a lot of social upheaval. This happens repeatedly, time and time and again, when you have changes within the society where sort of core ideas around, particularly gender structures of power, the gender hierarchy, who has more power and not, based on gender, when those sort of roles get blurred a little bit, even slightly, even, not even happening in reality, but just perceived to be happening, can cause society at large to start questioning gender roles, gender norms, what is the future of us, who are we supposed to be, etc. Another key contribution made by feminist thinkers and activists has been around questioning essentialist views on gender. So, essentialism can be defined by first an idea that gender is based on biology rather than anything else, and that the idea that gender is a part of nature, that it's naturally innate, that people are automatically born depending on how individuals are sexed and gendered at birth. It's a boy, it's a girl, based on genitalia. That out of that, they have innate sort of sense of not only their gender, but how to perform, how to act, how to think, how to be their gender. So, and that, therefore then women are naturally feminine, right? So we have the stereotypes of like, women are naturally nurturing, caregivers, emotional. Men are providers, strong, not emotional, not, sensible, intelligent, leaders, etc., right? And this has led to this sort of thinking around gender, essentialist view of gender has led to um, not only enforcing the idea of a gender binary, that men and women are, biologically different, which they are not, but also categorizing particularly women, and as well as men who don't fit neatly into the dominant gender ideals as being either sick or wrong or need to be fixed and so forth. And we're going to explore this a lot more later on the semester around the sort of the essentialist construction, the medicalization of female bodies, queer bodies, and so forth. But out of critiquing this, critiquing these essential views of gender, feminists have advocated around the social construction of gender. So it's very much around that gender is not what you're born with, but how your environment shapes you. So they do talk a lot about the differences between sex, which is based on biology, and gender, though many feminists nowadays even critique the idea of sex. Why are we gendering certain body parts as being necessarily male or female? And even that the way that the medical texts have written about certain body parts, or even certain physiological responses and so forth, has been very gendered and not necessarily reflecting what these physiological symptoms, functions, and so forth are. So even here, sex can be socially constructed, but oftentimes when people talk about social construction, they're mostly focusing around gender. And that, therefore, by focusing on gender, we learn about how gender is taught to us through a multitude of ways, both informally and formally. And that through our teaching, through our disciplining of gender, we perform the gender roles our society teaches us to perform. And this gets into also this by critiquing essentialist ideas around gender, feminists have also critiqued the way that we think about the universal subject. And has a lot of bearance in fields of literature and art, in the sense of, so much of the writings and literature that's out there has been put into the perspective of a male protagonist or so forth, as if his experience, or this male person's experience, will be the experience for everyone, and that we can all relate to it, right? And that how men experience the world is going to be, therefore, then how we should all experience the world. And of course, feminists have critiqued that as well, that this universal subject that is very much based on male entitlement has, not reflected the experiences primarily of women, but also other men who maybe don't have certain privileges that, the universal subject might have. And in that, then, feminists have emphasized the differences based on gender, that, the way that we experience the world will be very different. Just because you may yourself not experience this, or feel this, or think this, or so forth, does not mean it does not exist. That my experiences are valid, and what I see and what I experience, what I feel, what I believe are valid. That my reality is just as valid as your reality. So another, really great feminist thinker who articulated this brilliantly was, Simone, who wrote the classic, phrase, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman. No biological, physiological, or economic fate determines the figure that the human female presents in society. It's a civilization as a whole that produces this creature, intermediate between male and eunuch, which is described as feminine. And as much as it was important to challenge the universal subject being based on primarily a male model, also a very privileged male model, mainstream feminists themselves were using a universal subject or model of female women experiences to articulate women's oppression. And as much as feminism has worked to be inclusive of women, it is also a history of exclusion. And that even, going back to those waves that I really quickly went through, they weren't representing the lives and the struggles of many women. So, for example, that voting, as much as, getting the right to vote was important, voting was not accessible to all women, particularly women of color. It was not until 1965 that Native American women finally gained the right to vote. And when we talk about the second wave, around the amazing and very important challenges that feminists in the 60s and 70s did to the very important work that they did to fight for equal employment, equal pay, access to education. Work does not set women free. And in fact, we still have incredible amounts of inequality in the workplace and so forth. But that also, the slogan like women should be able to work and that, we should fight against a glass ceiling. Well, many women were already working, particularly women of color, low-income women, and so forth, that, the slogans around the right to work seemed not applicable to their lives when they were, not one, already working, two, facing incredible amounts of oppression in their workforce, and three, being oppressed not only as a woman, but as a racial minority, as an immigrant, and so forth. And that gets into the fact that women may experience multiple or greater oppressions not solely because of gender, and that violence against women is not alone, and that it's tied to other violence. You cannot sort of say that it's about sexism, which it is, but sexism as alone does not, contribute to a lot of the violence against women. A lot of it is around economics, obviously a lot of it's around race. There's much more going into it than just sexism alone. And that gets into the factor of that race does matter when we're talking about gender. And that also, as what queer theorists will talk about, sexuality does matter. So, one person to talk about in regards to challenging the exclusionary politics is Audre Lorde. And we're actually going to touch a bit more on Audre Lorde as well as Adrienne Rich's work within the feminist movement as lesbian women. But I just wanted to give a little bit of a shout out to her. One is that she's a very important heroine of mine. Audre Lorde described herself always in this way, which was a black feminist, lesbian poet, mother, warrior. There was never an omission of any part. And the reason why is she believed that every part of her identity mattered and was powerful, as well as important to talking about not only her experiences, but also larger discussions around power, social justice, as well as social change. For her, she challenged the feminist movement, especially in the 80s. She would attend several National Women's Association conferences and speak out about the need of inclusion of not only lesbian women, which there was a lot of homophobia within the feminist movement and against lesbian activists, but also around race. And for her, she talked about how it is important that when we talk about the struggle for liberation among co-oppressed peoples and of organizing in coalition across differences of race, gender, sexual orientation, class, age, and ability. Her writings were based on the theory of difference, the idea that a binary opposition between men and women is overly simplistic, Although feminists have found it necessary to present the illusion of a solid, unified whole, the category of a woman itself is full of subdivisions. And for her, she very much talked about the authenticity of experience. She wanted her difference acknowledged but not judged. She does not want to be subsumed into one general category of a woman. And Lorde set out to confront issues of racism in feminist thought, theory, and activism. She maintained that a great deal of the scholarship of white feminists served to augment the repression of black women, a conviction that led to angry confrontations, especially by other mainstream feminists. But for her, it was very important that feminism understands difference. And in addition to, feminism not really talking about race and racial differences, but also the way that it had failed to explicitly address homosexuality within the female community. And very little feminist literature at the time was writing about lesbian or bisexual issues or advocating them on the same platform of women's rights, as well as, the reluctance to accept lesbian women within the feminist movement. And she has this, I just want to share this very important quote that sums up Audre Lorde, and it's so hard to sum up such an important person, but I'm going to read it here. Those of us who stand outside the circle of the society's definition of acceptable women, those of us who have been forged in the crucibles of difference, those of us who are poor, who are lesbians, who are black, who are older, know that survival is not an academic skill. It is learning how to take our differences and make them strengths. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. And this fact is only threatening to those women who still define the master's house as their only source of support. So this gets into intersectionality, and there's so much to talk about the history of intersectionality and how much of it came from critical black feminist thoughts. But I just want to talk about how important intersectionality has been within the feminist movement. One is the sort of emphasis around difference, right? As Audre Lorde was talking about. There is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. And intersectionality really makes us think about how people may experience oppressions in overlapping ways, not as separate and distinct entities that can be teased apart and viewed individually. And that it is impossible to separate out these experiences of oppression because they are also not the same oppression felt by others or equivalent oppressions. The homophobia that I might experience as a queer woman may be different to the homophobia that another woman might experience, but also adding into the intersection of their lives, their race, their academic background, their social class, even their geographic location can vary much, so that we might experience homophobia, but how it is different, it will be different, and to varying degrees. This concept is also designed to stress that for people who experience multiple oppressions, these oppressions cannot be put into a box and pulled out to be examined at will. They are an integral part of lived experiences and daily life. Again, instead of breaking people out into single issues, instead embracing the complexity, embracing the authenticity of lived experience, which cannot be pieced apart separately, that I experience these sort of things because I'm a woman, and then the next day I'll experience these sort of things because I'm a woman of color. We don't live like that. So while women's studies was being developed, and the first women's studies courses were happening, were first developed in the 70s, and then women's studies programs were becoming more and more popular and established through the 80s and through the 90s. Another sort of form of studies was developing as well, and that was gay and lesbian studies. So gay and lesbian studies originated in the 1970s, and that it sort of happened with a culmination of scholarship being focused on gay and lesbian lives and histories. So you have this sort of birth of scholarship, not only documenting gay and lesbian lives and looking at the history, but also thinking about it theoretically around the social control of sexuality and so forth. This field has now expanded, so there are programs out there that are still gay and lesbian studies. And it includes such as the academic study of issues raised in biology, sociology, anthropology, philosophy, psychology, sexology, political science, literature, history, and other fields, by which again, what combines them all is the examine of identity, lives, history, and experiences of queer people. So today, there are still programs out there for lesbian and gay and lesbian studies. Most often, they're now called LGBT studies. They could also be lesbian, gay, and transgender studies, or a combination of that, as well as queer studies. It is important, though, to note that queer studies is different from queer theory. Queer studies focuses on the lives and experiences of sexual minorities and gender minorities, whereas queer theory, which we're talking about in this week, is more about theoretical challenging of norms and the social construction of norms and so forth. So, the birth of queer theory. So I gave a little bit of an introduction in the last presentation, but just to sort of get more into how queer theory emerges from feminism, particularly women's studies. Queer theory is a field that a critical theory that emerged in the early 1990s out of the fields of both gay and lesbian studies and women's studies. And it's built on both of these disciplines. Upon first the feminist challenge to the idea that gender is part of the self, right? That gender is a core fundamental thing in how we experience the world and how we structure ourselves in our society. And then, as well as building upon gay and lesbian studies, in looking at the sort of close examination of socially constructed nature of sexual acts and identities. But whereas gay and lesbian studies have focused its research onto the natural and unnatural behavior with respect to homosexual behavior, queer theory expands its focus to encompass any kind of sexual activity. So not necessarily one that has an identity in the same sense of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and so forth, or an identity, but instead looking at sex and sexual expression, sexual desire, as well as gender and gender expression, identity, and so forth. That falls, and looking at it, how it falls into normative or deviant categories. So queer theory's intervention into feminist politics, because once queer theory entered in the 1990s, it has been a core fundamental stream in not only gay and lesbian studies, but especially in women's studies. You know, as I said something in the beginning of the course, I said you can't really talk about feminism or even women's studies without queer theory, because it's always going to be addressed. Primarily, queer theory today prods us to question our attachment to stable categories of women or just gender identities to begin with. And it challenges feminist theorists and activists to think of women's liberation as a separate event involving women only. Queer theorists say that it not only misses the sort of complexity of oppression, so just saying that, again, that you know, women's rights is just about women and that the oppression of women, it is not. Queer theorists would say that that is very a simplistic way of thinking about this movement, as well as it being, could miss some really key interventions around oppression, but it's also to assume and possess the very category that itself perpetuates injustice. And what they mean by that is that by focusing so much on womanhood and woman identity, you are making a lot of assumptions. One, there's this sort of biological overdeterminism that, you see particularly in feminist politics around women and their bodies. And understandably, it is reaction to the intense government control over women's bodies, especially their reproductive capabilities and choices over their bodies. But at the same time, this sort of, I'm here for women's rights, and then a sort of overemphasis on what it means to be a woman, well, it's narrowing. It's narrowing also that in the fact that there are many women who might not have ovaries, or there may be many women who do not have a vagina, or there are many women who might have a penis, etc. Right? To sort of state that our biological, physiological expressions determine our gender. It kind of goes back to way before in the debates around essentialism, which feminists have critiqued heavily, that that biology does not determine gender, and that we are taught gender. But at the same time, we use those same sort of essentialist discussions in our politics. And in doing so, it reinforces a gender binary that that women's issues are separate from men's issues, and that there's one camp and there's the other camp. And that really sucks for people who don't fit in either camp. But also, when you do that, when you sort of separate these two issues and label women as victims or men as oppressors, it creates a binary that doesn't lead to coalitions. It doesn't lead to a lot of change, and it can create a gender hierarchy. And so queer theorists really sort of intervene in feminist discussions, scholarship, and politics by saying that, these lines, these sort of gendered lines, which, I thought we were supposed to, as feminists, fight against, but yet we reinforce it when we're in our politics, should not be between women and men, but rather between those who repress individuals on the basis of race, sexual orientation, and gender identities, and those who advocate this repression based on normative ideas, family values, proper citizenship, and so forth. Like, that is where our focus should be, is on repression, not necessarily on that because I'm a woman I may experience this, but because of a man you don't experience this. This sort of binary discussion doesn't really help anybody and can be incredibly exclusionary to many people. We are going to be talking a lot more around exclusionary politics, particularly trans exclusionary politics, within the feminist movement, especially focusing on the Women's March on Washington. It is a long history. As you've read today, the feminist embattlements on the field of trans, which really sort of focuses on how since like the second wave, feminists have really been exclusionary towards not only trans individuals, but many other individuals as well, but particularly trans individuals. Starting from, just not even, allowing trans women to participate in the feminist movement, to also having trans exclusive events. One example is the Michigan Women's Music Festival that used to go on, which used to be a very, very popular music festival for women, and they denied entry towards anybody who was not biologically born a woman. So that meant that cisgender women could come in as well as trans men, but not trans women, which is awful. But Michigan Women's Music Festival is no longer here, though there are many other instances that this has occurred. And one is the more recent Women's March, which has been criticized, rightly so, by not only trans activists but also women of color, Native American women, around its exclusionary politics, around its of essentializing women's issues, to even, you can think about, and we're going to talk a lot about this in the last week of class, around that pink pussy hat, whereas there are many women out there who do not have a anatomical vagina, but are women. There are many men out there who have a anatomical vagina, but are men. There are also many vaginas out there, regardless of the gender who owns that vagina, that are not pink, right? So we're going to discuss this a lot more. I did want you to read the Feminist Embattlements on the Field of Trans, just to sort of get a taste of that conversation. We will be definitely talking about it on our last week of class, but it's just something worth taking into consideration. Another important intervention into feminist politics has been around the insistence of the primacy of politics over universal identity politics. Again, building upon this idea that, when we reinforce essential notions of identity and basically create camps, like you can't belong with us, you can't sit with us, we lose sight of the politics. We lose sight of what we're actually trying to fight against. We're too busy sort of saying you can't belong, or you don't experience the oppression the same way, therefore we cannot work together. So queer interventions into feminist politics has been very much around, first of all, we need to look at oppression and what's really happening, and instead of, basing it on identity politics, but also that we need to build coalition across identities. And, with that, many queer activists talk about, instead of, a women's march on Washington, why don't we talk about the multiplicity of genders as a way of disrupting that binary that keeps us locked in sort of the hierarchical binary system of a man and a woman. People's March on Washington, for example. And, in that, then they also contend that classifications like heterosexuality and homosexuality do not account for the whole range of sexual practices and desires existing in the world at any given moment. So not only binaries around gender, but also exclusionary politics around sexuality, that, you're either lesbian or gay, heterosexual, homosexual. And in reality, as what we're going to explore more, sexuality should be seen more as a spectrum, just like maybe gender should be seen more as a spectrum. So with that, I'm going to end this lecture. Next week, we're going to be focusing more on how oppressions are interconnected, following upon the arguments by queer theorists. And we're going to be focusing on sexism, heterosexism, and cissexism. And with that, what you're going to be doing is a photo voice on heteronormativity and cisnormativity. All the instructions are already up onto Blackboard, so you can check them out. But I'll also give a little mini lecture to walk you through that project so that you feel safe in doing it and secure and able to do it. But if you have any questions about this week or anything like that, please keep emailing me. Again, the best way to reach me is katherinefobier@mail.fresnostate.edu. All right, I will see you next week.